Everybody got it up? Now, there are 3 steps in performing analysis, and these steps apply to any text. But of course, we're going to look at a poem. Step 1, we have to read it. Let's do that now. Little boy. The sun lowers on our backyard in Kansas, and I am looking up through the circling spokes of a bicycle, asking my father as mindlessly as I would ask if he ever saw DiMaggio or Mantle, why we dropped the bomb on those 2 towns in Japan. And his face goes all wooden, the eyes freezing like rabbits in headlights, the palm of his hand slowly tapping the arm of a lawn chair that has appeared in family photographs since 1945. The shadow of my mother thrown across it, the green Packard in the background, which my father said he bought because after Saipan and Tinian and Okinawa, I felt like they owed it to me. These were names I didn't know, islands distant as planets, anonymous. Where is Saipan? Where is Okinawa? Where is the Pacific? Could you see the cloud in the air like the smoke from Eugene Messenbaum's semi, that huge cloud when he rolled it out on Highway 54 last winter? The hand is hammering the chair arm, beating it, and I know it's all wrong as I move backward on the garage floor and watch his eyes watching the sun in its evening burial and the spreading silver light and then darkness over the farms and vast flat fields, which I will grow so tired of, so weary of years later that I will leave. Watching then as I do now his eyes as they take in the falling rag of the sun, a level stare, a gaze that asks nothing and gives nothing, the sun burning itself to ashes constantly, the orange maize blackening in drought and waste, and he can do nothing, and neither can I. All right. We read it. Second thing we got to do. We just got to figure out what's going on. Literally, the story, the plot of the poem. Okay? So where do we start? How do we open up? Like if you were going to film this, how does the scene start?
Kansas.
Sunset in the backyard in Kansas.
Backyard in Kansas. All right, good. What's going on in that backyard in Kansas? Who are we focused on?
A boy and his father.
A little boy. What does the boy do?
He's watching his father.
Well, first he's just looking at a damn bicycle. Kids are stupid. They are. And I mean that with no hate in my heart. But like, talk to a kid for 5 minutes, you're like, you're stupid. He's just looking at a bike. And then he talks to his dad. What's he ask his dad?
Why did they bomb Japan?
It's an intense question. Okay. What happens as a result of that question?
His dad started tripping.
Be a little more specific. I'm not disagreeing, but like, describe that.
Like he said, he started like tapping the chair and like getting nervous, and his eyes started like
Yeah.
acting weird.
He's very disturbed by that question. Having a real hard time with that question. Okay. Or tripping if you like. What happens after that? After that question. The dad is unhappy with it. What do we do after that? We talk about a Packard for some reason. Anybody know what that is?
You know, a car or something?
It's an old car. Back in the day, was kind of nice. I mean, it's a nice car for 1945. So like, I think it doesn't explode. I think that's what it was. The dad says, I felt like they owed it to me, talking about the car. So you get the sense that like the car is kind of, a little bit of a big deal to the family. Okay.
He said they owed it to him after Japan too, so I wonder if he got it after the war or something like that.
Sounds like that, right? Okay, good. What do we do after that? The boy asks more questions. What's that?
I was just going to say what you said.
Oh, sweet. Okay. How would you describe these questions? There's several of them.
It's kind of like naive and innocent because he like doesn't know these things,
So where's the Pacific?
and that's like a big thing, you know. Most
Pretty
people
easy.
would know where it's at.
Yeah. Like, where's West? Anybody know? I don't. Let's make it up. Say it's that way. Pacific's that way too. You gotta walk for a while, but like you'll get there if you just go west. Yeah. Okay. So we're learning things about the father with his reaction to certain material, right? But we're also learning about the boy with the questions that he asks. The dad is still sort of beating that chair arm, so he's still upset. And then here in the last, third, last fourth of the poem, thereabouts, something else is going on, right? There's really no more questions. What happens in this section of the poem? Things feel different for some reason.
It's like he's talking like he's an adult. It's like flashing forward.
The boy. How do you know?
Because like the tense is changed. Like I will grow.
I didn't quite hear you. I coughed. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's like the tense has changed. Like instead of saying I would, he starts saying I will grow.
And he says, I will grow so tired of, years later I will leave.
Yeah.
So we like flash forward to the future, but then we understand we're really in the present
And
with an
he's
adult.
passing it backward as a child.
Yeah, he's kind of looking back on a thing that happened. Cool. Okay. And then we end up talking about some weird stuff in those last couple lines, which we'll get to at some point. Okay. Pretty good summary, right, of the poem. Now what we got to do is the third step. The third step tends to be more complicated than the first two. We got to think about what's going on here. I like to open the floor to you guys first, because ask Grace. She was here for the last. I talked for an hour. I could just talk, but I'd like to hear from you guys. Anything stand out to you as maybe important and you're not sure why, or you're kind of interested in a line, the way something is phrased? Did you guys find anything of note?
I was just talking about how traumatized the father was. Just
Yeah.
thinking about it. I mean,
How do you know? First of all, we're going to practice pointing to the poem as much as we can.
this when he's talking about his face went wooden, his eyes are freezing like rabbits.
In response to the question, right?
The question that
Yeah.
the boy initially asked.
Those rabbits especially. I'm having a time clearing my throat. Those rabbits, his eyes freeze like rabbits in headlights, right? Rabbits, when rabbits are in headlights, what does that tell you about the rabbits? They're scared. What else are they? Why are they scared? That seems like a dumb question, but I haven't. Why?
They lock up.
Because the car is big and the rabbit probably won't move.
And the rabbit is small.
Yeah.
Yeah. That could be important. I mean it, because not every detail is going to matter, and it always depends upon where your argument goes, right? But one thing we could argue in this line is that in this moment, according to the speaker, the father looks like one of those rabbits. He looks shaken, but also powerless. He looks small.
Yeah.
Because the car in this metaphor is what?
I want to say the war.
Good question.
The question. I mean, the war is tied into it, right? But it's that question. And now all of a sudden, you understand there's some real strong something going on with that question, with that father's relationship to it, that he could be made to feel like that, right? Just from that line. That's what details do. All right, good.
I also found it interesting, like, most people would say deer in a headlight.
They would.
As opposed to rabbits.
They
So
would.
that's probably, like, once you said the gravity of the question to the comparison of the car to a rabbit versus a deer,
Yeah.
it just seems more like.
It feels intentional, doesn't it? It does. And part of it, I also wonder, because I can't know this, everybody in these poems is way older than all of us. That could be a thing people said in Kansas back in the day. I have no idea. But yeah, either way, it feels very intentional.
Mhm.
The rabbits. Good. Did you guys notice anything else like that? And again, you don't have to have a reading, but just it kind of struck you as like, well, that's interesting. Like what's going on there? Sure.
Okay, there's like no line numbers, but it talks
Yeah.
about, the lawn chair has appeared in family photographs since 1945, the
Yeah.
shadow of my mother thrown across it.
Yeah.
And I think the use of the word shadow there is really important because it like signifies like realness versus not realness. So possibly like the shadow of his mother could be referring to like her absence.
We do this in every class. Okay. I will allow maybe for that. Okay? My issue though, in terms of proof, is I don't know how we would prove that. You know what I'm saying? Because on the flip side of that, I guess argument that you're starting to make there, and I frame it like this because, again, Grace can attest to this. Somebody in the very last class did the same thing. We're talking about a family photograph, and we're talking about the mother's shadow, so we're also supposing that she is there. Because you have to be there for your shadow, right? We understand how that works. What I think is going on, and again, I'm not entirely sort of discrediting what you're saying, but I'm saying that at the very least there's something else happening too, is, I guess we got to cover this now. What's that question about, first of all? We got to make sure everybody's on the same page historically. Why did we drop those 2 bombs on Japan? What are we talking about?
World War II.
World War II. Right about the end, what happened?
The U.S. dropped nukes on
Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Obliterated those towns, killed a whole bunch of people. Yeah. Okay. And the son asks him about this. And the father reacts a certain way. So in some way, on top of everything else, we're talking about nuclear war, nuclear detonation. To me, that image of a shadow thrown across the lawn chair, right? You guys have seen pictures of like the blast. See like shadows of people burned into like walls. And I think at the very least, we're also doing that. We're kind of recalling that imagery, right? Now my question is, why are we doing that? What does it suggest if we say, oh, my mother's shadow in this picture reminds me of the shadows you would see when looking at like bombing footage? What are we implying has happened to have that shadow be that way?
Death.
A little more specific. That there's been a nuclear explosion, right? So that begs the question, because there is no literal explosion in this poem, right? What nuclear blast has occurred in the poem? It's easier than you think.
What's the question?
It was the question. He's like, I'm awesome. Yeah, it has to be. That's the only thing. The way it shakes the dad, right? It has to be that question. So, okay, so now we learn that question is we're comparing it to a nuclear bomb going off in a city. An atomic bomb going off in a city. That's a big deal. And if you're not sold on that reading, which I don't know why you wouldn't be, I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about. The title of the poem, Little Boy. Does anybody know why that title matters?
Is this the name of the bomb?
The first one. Good. The first bomb that we dropped was called Little Boy because people have a sense of humor. The second one was bigger. They called it Fat Man. They chuckled. I don't know. All right, so the little boy in the poem is the speaker. But now, once we talk a little bit, we think a little more about the subject matter. We think about the implications of that question too, how we're representing it. Now we're like, well, it's called Little Boy. From the jump, the speaker is telling us that in some way he is like that bomb. Right? So there's like an act of destruction or something that's going to happen as a result of that boy.
Does the dad have like PTSD or something? Because it says like it says that he started off like tapping the chair, and then the more questions that he was getting, actually started like hammering the chair, like he started punching it.
That's what I was thinking too.
Here's what I hate about that reading. I'm always as transparent as I can with you guys. What sucks about that reading is two things. One, you guys always give me that reading. And two, so what? No, I mean it. Like, say he does have some kind of, which he may. Why do we care?
I'm wondering if that's the reason, like if that's the bomb that you're referring to, like look, is he the explosion or is his son the explosion when he leaves?
Well, I think literally speaking, it has to be the question. Like the closest thing we have to an act of destruction is the question. Because the way the poem reads, everything else kind of comes off of that, right? But what I'm worried about with the PTSD, because again, I get it all the time. You guys are, it's one of the assumptions you walk through the door with. That he has PTSD because he was in war and it seems like he's not happy about it. I'm not saying he maybe doesn't have it. I'm not sure we can prove it, but at the very least, maybe. But at the end of the day, if we're trying to make an argument about a poem, and our argument in some way has to help us understand the world these characters are from, if our argument is just, war fucked that guy up, it's like, sure. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a banal claim, which is an argument that's just not really worth making. But for whatever reason, because again, we all went to the same kinds of schools, but I went way earlier. I didn't get the PTSD thing, like the way that you guys must have gotten it at some point. So we're wired differently in that. I mean that. Like it's weird to think, but don't worry about it. So the point is, maybe, but unless we do more with it somehow, I just don't know that it's very constructive. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm not trying to come at you super hard, but like I'm going to get that damn reading. All right, where were we? Oh, so the boy is in some ways tied to this blast, this act of destruction. We learn later, as you alluded to, he's going to leave. So it seems like a lot of weight, a lot of significance is being put on this question, right? It has a lot of power somehow, potentially. What we got to start thinking about then is why that is. Why is it so powerful, this question? I don't know who asked that or who said something. You're all wearing masks. Great. We'll start with the father. Why does the father react the way that he does, do you think?
His children are childless, and he probably does have some sort of bad emotional connection to those memories.
What memories?
The memories of the bombs that were dropped.
Okay.
Or possibly been in war or alive during that time.
Well, all right, so let's solve a couple of those possibilities real quick. One that we had was that the father was possibly in the war. What do you guys think? Can we come down a little more firmly one way or the other on whether or not he was in the war?
The way that he responded to the question when his eyes went wide is.
That helps.
Right, because it's kind of like symbolizing he's having his own flashbacks with him hammering his hand and tapping his hand.
He definitely struggles with it. No, but that's tenuous though. That doesn't. I mean, he could have just not liked the idea of 10,000s of people dying in a blast. You know, that
Right,
could
but it
affect
could also
somebody.
be to help him replicate, which could it could be causing him to like replicate sounds in his mind because his mind is trying to go back and do the flashback to the war that he had, to the war that he had seen.
I mean, again, maybe, but that feels pretty tenuous. The point I'm making is we have much stronger evidence.
Possibly when they said I felt like they owed it to me.
In response to what?
The car,
He says he bought it,
because after Sapien and
Tinian and Okinawa, the Japanese islands, these places in the Pacific Theater. After those places, I felt like they owed me that car, he says. Now, we're talking about 1945. And I asked my last class this, and they didn't know. Why is 1945 a big year?
Is that the one I did?
Your World War II ended. That's a big deal. So since that year, we've had this car. And my dad said, after these Japanese islands, I felt like they owed me that car. That kind of tells us what about the dad?
He was in the war.
Yes. And with the money that he got when he got back, he bought the car. That's much stronger evidence, right? That's direct. You could easily. Okay, good. So he was in the war, and again, is America in the 40s? Like he's an adult man. Like he got drafted. The point I'm making is you can almost assume every adult man in the 40s would have been in the war. Why does that question affect him like that, though? Why doesn't he never answers, right? He keeps hitting the chair, his eyes get big, he never answers.
Is it because, like, whatever he says, it's not gonna make any sense to this kid who, like, doesn't even know where the Pacific is?
Explain that a little bit. Why do you feel that way?
Like, this kid doesn't know where the Pacific Ocean is. So
Yeah.
his father could never even begin to explain, like, the concept of war and why people fight.
Why not? Why do people fight? We're not children. We could figure it out. Why do people fight? Why is there war? To get what? To get what we want. Well, couldn't we just share?
Nobody wants to do that.
Okay. You guys are cool with that answer? What you're essentially saying is, well, we have war because we have war.
That's kind of hard to explain,
It is. I'm not disagreeing. But the small point I'm making here is, number one, yes, the child is an idiot, because children are idiots. But also, the question in and of itself isn't something we could really solve
Yeah,
ourselves.
he probably didn't have a choice.
Okay.
Like,
The father.
If he directly dropped the bombs, he probably didn't have a choice because would have been taking, like, orders from someone.
Sure. And also, I mean, there were like, I forget, 4 guys in the plane or something. Like, it's all but certain he wasn't one of those people. He was just a dude in the army. But again, his son is a tiny idiot. He's not making that distinction, right? All right. So one thing we got to figure out, and we're going to have a couple ways of coming at it, but I need to put a couple things on the board here. Number one, we keep coming back to this idea. The son is, just by the questions he asks, right, the thoughts he has, is almost completely innocent, not just of war, but of anything, right? Where is the Pacific, he says. Was the cloud, talking about the mushroom cloud, was it as big as that big truck last year? He knows nothing. Because he's a small person. That small people don't know anything, okay? So he's innocent. He's ignorant of the world, okay? That's what innocence means. The father, on the flip side, we learn, is much more experienced. He's been in war, if nothing else, right? So he knows a good deal more. Just about everything. And that's most of the poem, right? Has something to do with this. Has something to do with where the boy is versus where the dad is. And bridging that gap, whatever that looks like. So much of the poem is thinking about that, right? All right. One thing I want to direct your attention to, and we've talked about it, but we haven't looked at it closely. Can somebody read me the question that the son asks?
Why we dropped the bomb on those 2 towns in Japan?
That's what he wants to know, right? Now there's a couple answers to this, and all of them are valid. What about that question specifically, if you had to think about details, bothers the father so much? I didn't hear the very last thing you said. What? Sure. Well, so first of all, when the son says we, who is he talking about?
Like America.
Just all of us, right? That's one of those weird things you get, whether you like it or not. That's why so many countries hate us. But no, like if you're a citizen of a country, you're like, well, you guys, it's like, I was not asked, you know? But for the boy, why we dropped the bomb. So the U.S., but also in this poem, the father and the son. Why did we do that? Dad? Tell me about it. The father basically says nothing in the poem, but he does say one thing. What does he say? They owed it to me. Speaking of the Packard, yes?
Yes.
Now, with what we just said about the question in mind, is there anything, details-wise, perhaps interesting about what the father says about this car?
They refers to America and not.
Yeah. After whatever he saw, which we don't learn about, I'm sure it was horrific in some ways. It is war. But after all that shit, they owed it to me, he says, meaning the car. And they, of course, in U.S. government, whoever's calling the shots. Okay. Well, does this difference matter?
Yeah.
Yes.
Why? What are we learning about these characters?
The boy's innocence has him think that, we are America, but as the father since the father has more experience
Yeah.
with the war and everything, he's kind of like dissociating himself with American government, but he still follows it.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. He's not like a revolutionary or anything.
Right.
But he's just like, dude, there's a whole bunch of they going on. There's not, there's
This
we
not
business.
thinking It was them.
Yeah. Who's right, do you think?
Probably the one with experience.
Maybe. Why do you say that?
I mean, like, I just feel like his sentiment is probably more accurate to what's truly like the whole of America.
Because it's been informed by his
Yeah.
experience. Okay. Yeah, maybe. There's a whole bunch of Japanese people that see it this way. I don't know that they're wrong. But again, look, dude, we have conversations about other things all the time, even in 2020, right? And you'll hear people say, well, I wasn't there. That's what's happening here. The boy's like, we. And the dad's like, no. No, sorry, no. I was a grunt. I was just on the ground. I was taking orders, right? So we have this interesting line drawn here too. As you referenced, the question of innocence. This is in some ways perhaps a more innocent perspective of the world or something. And this comes from experience. The father said, look, I know all kinds of things. One thing I know is that this is not a we situation. Which is interesting.
It could be because he didn't make any sort of decision to drop Fat Man or Little Boy in Japan, but the way that the kid sees it, because as you said, he's an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
He says we because he believes that America as a whole made that decision. When they, as the father knows it, is that the government and the military made the decision, and we
Yeah.
have no part in it.
Yeah. So one thing we're kind of saying then, and this is fun, we don't usually get to this. What are we kind of, we're in the neighborhood of an argument right now, okay? One argument we could start to make, that the poem is making, we're saying something about, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. We're saying something about America. We'll do that. What is the poem maybe saying about how America works? You basically just said it. I'm just trying to give you a framework.
There's not really any.
It's not as united as we'd like to think. What do you say there in the back? Okay.
Unless they were controlled by the government and doing stuff we don't.
Okay. Is there a way to get those two together? You're saying that kind of the quote unquote the man is really in charge, right? And you're saying we're not as united as we would maybe like to think.
I guess we're not on the same page with the government.
Yeah, because we're not. I like a good although statement. So like a good working thesis, if you're ever in trouble, you start with although. Although. I don't know, actions. There's a better word for that, but you know. Although that, because this is the opinion of the boy. This is a fancier way to sum up what the boy has just said, right? According to the father, anyway, if we're saying the father is more informed by experience, the world that he's just seen more of, one argument we're starting to make in this poem is what? I'll start it for you. This is just what you said, right? So I'm not supplying anything here. Forgot how to spell all this. Because why? Although many would have you, believe the U.S., as the name implies, is united in its actions, such unity is impossible because... Why?
The people don't really have a say what the government does, as much as you would like to. I'm on my board, let's go, I'm just progressing.
I didn't hear what you said. My mind wanders, I forget how to spell. What'd you say?
I was just, I was happy that I'm on the board, something I said on the board.
Although many would have you believe the U.S., as the name implies, is united in its actions. Such unity is impossible because the people that make up the country have little to no say in its operation. Innocence versus experience. Maybe. This is a working thesis. This is the sort of thing, maybe this is the case in the poem. Maybe this is something we could go find. Now we can go look for more things to either refute or support that position. Right? Time is it. We'll get out of here. 12:30? 12:15. You're like, slow down. All right. Numbers confound me. I never remember when we get out of here, but I know you guys are good for that. All right. Well, let's go hunting a little bit. We got some more to think about, too. Why does the son ask his father this question, do you think? He runs up to his dad. Mindlessly, he says, "Why did we drop those bombs on those towns?" Why did he ask his dad that? Do you think?
I guess he really just sees it like just because he's older, you might know.
Okay. Kids assume older folks know things.
I hate when kids immediately run up to me and ask me a question.
Do I didn't quite
I
hear
hate
you.
when kids run up to me and ask a question. Like I don't know.
You said you hate it?
I hate it with a passion.
I mean, if you ever plan on having children, you're going to have to move past that, dog. That's all they do. Why? Especially your parents. Look, you guys are not far removed from legit qualifying as children. You may not like that, but like that's real. Why? If you can remember.
Maybe he knew his dad was in the war.
Was it I don't know?
Maybe he knew his dad was in the war.
I still didn't hear you. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, maybe he knew his dad was in the war.
That's part of it. He almost certainly knew that his father fought in some capacity. Yes.
We think our parents know everything, like they are the ones that teach us everything. We trust
Yeah.
them the most out of everybody, how we're supposed to,
Sure.
so.
My son told me this morning I could lift up the town. And I was like, yeah, man. Sure. I'm not gonna. I would hurt my back, is what I said to him. But like, yeah, you need me to? I got you. He's like, yeah, you won't do that. We'll just go to grandma's. I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. Yeah. So for all kinds of reasons we don't have to go into, but your parents, especially when you're young, are in charge of your whole world to a large degree. So they have power over your very existence. And I guess when we're young, one thing we're kind of reading into this bit of the poem is we read that power beyond us. When you're small, you're like, oh, our parents are so powerful over us. That power must extend, right? A couple of days ago, my son also said I could beat Darth Vader. And again, I was like, I wouldn't want to, but if he comes in the house, yeah, we'll have to talk about it. Like, I know this is a silly thing, but I mean, that's a huge deal for him. Darth Vader's a bad, bad man, right? So also part of that innocence is assuming that our parents, in this case specifically the father, is very, 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 very capable and powerful. They have authority, right? Why did we drop the bombs? It's not just that position of innocence, maybe where we're all united. That's part of it. Another way to think about it, we're thinking about how we view our parents, especially when we're young. They know everything. They've seen everything. They're in charge. But if we take a similar sort of approach, right? Although the boy in the poem, points to the sort of assumption we have about parents, right? They're kind of in the know. They're responsible. Has anyone crossed the threshold yet where you've learned your parents aren't nearly as responsible as you thought they were? Woo! Mine was high school.
Yeah.
I can't tell you about it.
Oh,
There's probably some scars in here. But like, yeah, that's a real thing. So although that, and look, we have that narrative, right? We've all seen movies or what have you. Why is the mom and dad, why are they always smiling all the time? And like, they pick their kids up after practice and shit. Like, what? It's not always like that, right? So although we have this narrative, yeah, again, you could kind of say some elements of the poem maybe poke holes in that, right? One of those holes is the they. Because again, the father's like, I'm not in charge of what you think I'm in charge of. Right? So that's one. Do we have anything else like that? Because to me, it ties into this working thesis. It ties into the working thesis I just gave you. There's questions of power, control, authority in this poem. Who decides? So like, for instance, what does the dad decide for himself? Not much. He makes one decision at least.
The car.
Big car.
Fucking car. He decides to buy a car that none of us have ever heard of. Yeah. You could argue if you wanted to. Be interesting. I mean, he can't even make the decision to answer his son, right? I guess you could say he decides not to answer him, but does he? I don't know. That'd be an interesting question.
Like silence is also another answer.
No, I'm saying, yeah, and you could, on the one hand, you could argue he decides to do that. But what I'm wondering is, does he? Does he decide not to, like, what, we covered this before, but like, what would he have said?
Right.
Look, son, given the geopolitical climate at the time, right? What could he say? There's nothing he could say. Well, doesn't that take the power from him? So even part of our argument, and we don't have time to explore this fully in class, but like part of our argument might be he doesn't even have control with this question. His son decides to ask the question for reasons that we don't really get. Mostly he's just tiny and they ask everything. But then the father is almost disarmed by the very act of asking the question. Why is he so bothered by the question? There's more to say there.
I was thinking maybe it has something to do with like how our kids view us, like children view parents as like the biggest thing in the world, like
Mhm.
the best person ever.
Yeah.
And like when his son associates we dropped the bomb as in you, my parent, why did you do this?
Mhm.
Why did you make this happen? So he probably like now believes like his son like sees him as the perpetrator of these bombs that destroyed like large amounts of land and people and
Well, let me help you a little bit. I'm with you to a point.
yeah.
Where you lose me is the perpetrator business. Because that's your experience talking. That's you, like, you've had some history classes or whatever. The little boy, I don't know, is coming at it quite like that.
Mhm.
He asks his mindlessly as if he's talking about baseball right before that, right? To him, it's all just, I heard about a thing. Like it's... So, where I would twist what you had to say right at the end is, I agree that him asking the question tells us that he thinks the father is going to have an answer. Maybe even had a say in the business, you know, like. But to me, one way we could read the father's reaction is he recognizes that too. But again, the son doesn't know anything. The father knows all kinds of things. What does the father know is wrong with the son's question? Like the father knows what about himself?
That he had nothing to do with it.
That he had no power over that situation. So one thing you could also think about, one line of argument you could consider, one of the reasons the father doesn't know how to respond, how's he going to explain war? How's he going to explain geopolitical, whatever the hell? How's he going to explain to his son that he's not in charge like that? Like, look, son, I know you think I run the world, but I don't. How's he going to explain? He can't explain that, right? So that's also a problem here. And that brings me to this. We have enough time, just enough time to do this. I hope one thing I've illustrated is there are all kinds of things we can talk about in this poem, right? I've directed you guys a little bit, but you have largely done an excellent job at pinpointing details. We kind of talk it out as a class, right? That's all you're trying to do when you're analyzing this stuff. One thing we have to address is the final third of the poem. Because it is wildly different from everything else. Where do we start? So, first of all, and this is fun, I believe it starts at the hand is hammering. Everything after that, that's all one sentence. Isn't that wild? I always have to remind myself when I read this out loud to breathe real good at the hand. I'm like, the hand, and then I'm ready to go. Because it's all one sentence, which is kind of interesting.
I didn't even notice that already.
Oh, I know. It's my job. All one sentence. But, aside from that, and again, there's ways to talk about that. We may do that later. The imagery here. What kind of stuff are we talking about? Like, first of all, this is the section where we find out that the boy, like we look forward like years later when he leaves, and then we're like, oh, okay, so this whole poem is actually an adult looking back at a thing that happened when he was a boy, right? That's where we find that out. But all the imagery here is different too. There's no more, where is the Pacific, baseball player. There's none of that stuff, right? Like, how's the imagery different in this section?
It's no longer so innocent.
It's what now?
It's no longer so innocent.
No. Can you point us to something that seems less innocent?
I mean, it's like he's saying he knows it's all wrong, the questions he was asking.
Yeah, and you get the sense he didn't really know that at the time. Yeah.
He knows now.
Yeah. What else? I just want to look for a couple examples.
We went from describing a sunset in a backyard to the sun burning itself to ashes constantly.
Yeah.
Corn blackening and drought. And
Yeah.
frost.
Just fucking famine and apocalypse.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's how the poem ends. Pretty different. Pretty different tone. Now that's interesting. That he strikes such a wildly different tone in the last however many lines. Well, there's an easy start to how we could talk about that. Why do you think we have the tonal shift?
Older.
Yeah. He's, an adult. Or thereabouts.
Yeah.
He's enough an adult to talk about star death and fields going to waste. Right? Okay. But aren't we also kind of saying then, and I think you were basically implying this, that in the poem anyway, an adult perspective is that?
Yeah.
Is that all an adult perspective is in this poem? I'm honestly asking. I'm not trying to lead you with that one.
That's what it seems like.
It's hard to find much else, isn't there?
Yeah.
Just dark.
It's pretty dark.
Or it's like when you, as you grew up, you realized that the world had already gone to shit. So
Yeah. Now we can get a little more specific, because again, in a paper, you don't want as much as it may make sense at times. You don't want your thesis to be "and the world is shit." Like we gotta. So, with the little time we have left, we're gonna try to define that. What is it? Can we pinpoint it? What is this now adult describing? I mean, if he's an adult now, then it seems like, first of all, he's on this side, right? So that means he understands maybe something his father understood. He knows something he didn't know then, right? But what is it, do you think? Can we use that imagery to maybe figure it out? What sorts of things is he describing? Do what? What did you say?
Like crops.
Okay, yeah, the crop's going bad, the sun dying, which, spoiler, is going to happen. Do you guys know that? Okay. A billion years from now, the sun's going to explode, swallow the earth. No big deal. Well, I mean, we won't be here, so. That's a thought. We won't be here. That's another thing.
Yeah.
Bummer that.
I don't know.
How does he close the poem?
And he can do nothing, and neither can I.
About what?
Anything.
About the world around him, there's nothing you can do.
ultimately, we're powerless. in some sense.
But the sense is what we're trying to pinpoint.
And like, trying to, and operating the entire world, just two people, right, or just.
They're too small.
We're too small, yeah, we're powerless. There's nothing that we can do that can drastically change the world with just two people.
They're almost like two woodland creatures in headlights.
Rabbits.
Maybe. All right. So, on the one hand, we can't choose to declare war. I think that's pretty easy. We can't affect whether or not the sun dies. We don't really have a say on the weather, which gets you the drought business. We know all these things, though, again, right? So if we can't take that any further, I don't know if that's going to give us much of a paper. But what else in the poem might we not have control over? Because again, we don't say we don't have control over these things in the end. Phrasing is important. He can do nothing, and neither can I. He can do nothing.
Well, it's talking about like the death of the sun and the death of crops, so maybe it's going to like just the death of people, like we all die and there's nothing.
Yeah, but again, I mean, we're not going to... I mean, yes. In some sense, all art is about that because we make art with the knowledge we're going to one day die. We want to leave something past ourselves. But we're not going to argue that in paper, right? Like, we're all going to die. I know. Bum me out. What else in the poem, and we phrased this differently earlier, like what can they control? What do they decide in the poem?
The car,
It seems like it's the fucking car. And like, that's maybe it.
so we control what we call.
We control anything.
But nothing at the same time.
We control nothing. Yeah, and that's an interesting question to like, if you guys want, we can't do that in 10 minutes. But to explore the idea, what it means by he can do nothing, it's like, well, you can accomplish erasure, like death, oblivion. We're not doing that, don't freak out. But it's, with the line of questioning we're thinking about here right at the end of class, there's a question about power, again, choice, the decisions you make, coupled with this question of innocence and experience. And it seems like the boy in this poem learns a lesson. Maybe he gets some kind of an answer to this question, even though it's not really from his father. It's years later, he figures it out for himself. But the answer he arrives at isn't a fun one, right? So as a working thesis, what would that look like? If you want to use, although crushed it for me in college, man, this got me through like every class. You start with an easy reading, one that anyone could offer. Although, you know, the question of innocence and experience often comes down to simple knowledge, right? In this poem, it's more specific than that. And what we learn is that as we grow older, adulthood is really about accepting how powerless you are, how little you control in the world. Something like that. Yeah, that's sigh-worthy for sure. Questions about any of that? Okay. For next time. First of all, by the end of this week, and this is all in the syllabus, you have an explication due. It says little boy, which you can do because we just talked about it. Or, if you'd rather, you could do old men playing basketball. You probably want to watch the video first before you do that one. By the way, old men playing basketball, that discussion, way more fun than this one. This one's a downer. Old men playing basketball, I'm not going to ruin it for you. There are some other things going on in that poem that you are not aware of. I'll leave it at that. Anyway, you can explicate either one of those. What is an explication? It's basically what we just did. You know? Start with like 1 or 2 sentences, quick summary, right? Tell me what's going on in the poem. And then for the bulk of it, dive into some details, right? Like we started class with the rabbits in the headlights, and you said something to begin with. I don't remember what it was now. Was it the rabbits? Yeah, it was right at the top of class. You started us with something. Was it rabbits? Okay. Whatever it was. But we started with a line, right? And I know some of you were like, why are we talking about the rabbits so damn much? But we did that for a couple minutes, and we got somewhere, right? And
it was the I said it was the freezing light.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that started us off, and we just follow that train of thought, right? That's basically what I want you to do. I want you to the best of your ability, because it's all about practice, dive into one of these poems, look at some actual details, line some stuff up, like, oh, does this make sense together? What does this mean? What does any of this say about the world of these characters? Any of that, right? That's what we're trying to do. Another way to think about it, an explication is like a super low stakes shot at a paper, right? Super, like, if you screw it up, it doesn't matter type of, just see what you can come up with, right? But keep the 3 traps in mind that I mentioned to the best of your ability. Focus on details, all that stuff. For next week, we have other homework I'm going to talk about then. We're also reading, I believe it's Body and Soul. Check your syllabus, please. That's all I got.
Is it due Wednesday or is it due Saturday?
Homework, unless otherwise stipulated, is always due Saturday.
Okay.
But next week may actually be otherwise due. It's on the syllabus. I don't remember.
Okay.
But fair question. Anything else? All right. I'll see you in a week. Thank you.